Yet another very important part of the opinion, which has an immediate effect for all of us in Colorado, is on Congress's spending power. Congress has the power to raise taxes and spend money to pay the debts, provide for the defense, and the general welfare of the United States. Up to 1936, there was a debate about whether Congress could spend money on anything, as long as they said the general welfare, it's sort of generally helpful to the country, or that Congress could only spend to carry out the other enumerated powers in the Constitution. Wrongly, in my view, at least based on originalism, in 1936, the Supreme Court said Congress can spend money for any purpose, not just the purposes in the Constitution. And that's how we have this federal leviathan that spends huge amounts of money on things like education, agriculture, welfare programs, care for the poor, things that as the Constitution was originally understood, were supposed to be state responsibilities. In 1937, in a follow-up case on the spending power, the Supreme Court recognized that once we let Congress out of the box and say they can spend on anything, well, isn't there some risk that Congress could use this spending power coercively to force states to enact laws which Congress itself doesn't have the power to enact, but Congress could coerce states with the spending power to make them enact laws. In 1980, and I think that the court was right to write, and the court said that the particular spending program that was at issue in that case, the Stewart Machine case in 1937, that yeah, that would be a problem if Congress did that, but in this particular thing, which involved state grants for unemployment insurance programs, it wasn't coercive, and so it was okay. In 1987, the Supreme Court in a 6-3 decision said essentially the same thing. Congress in South Dakota versus Dole. Congress told states, if you don't raise your drinking age to 21, because we're very concerned about highway accidents caused by 18-year-olds driving from Connecticut to New York, getting all drunk, and then driving home and killing people on the way, we will cut off 5% of your state highway funds. The Supreme Court majority, an opinion by Chief Justice Rehnquist, said that's okay because this isn't really coercive either. It's a relatively mild inducement. In the 2012 NFIB case, Chief Justice Roberts, looking back at Stewart Machine, South Dakota versus Dole, and the general principles of federalism, said, boy, there sure is a world of difference between between the South Dakota thing, which amounted to less than 0.5% of the state's budget, and what Congress is saying now. And Congress, with its Medicaid mandate in Obamacare, said, we've set up this basic matching grant program to provide medical care for poor people, the blind, the disabled, some children, and this grant, in every state, it's at least 20% of the state budget, and the federal share of that is 10%, so we're talking 10% of the overall state budget. And Congress says, states, you have to expand instead of traditional Medicare, not only do you, besides the regular people you're doing now, you have to drastically expand it so that anybody whose income is lower than 133% of the officially defined federal poverty level has to be eligible for Medicaid in your state. So for the first time ever, states were told, you've got to provide medical welfare to able-bodied, childless adults who are not in poverty. And if you don't, you lose everything, or you can lose everything, depending on the discretion of the Secretary of Health and Human Services. You can lose everything in your federal Medicaid grants. Chief Justice Roberts contrasts this South Dakota versus Dole, the highway funds, less than 0.5% of a state budget, the relatively mild inducement, and he said in contrast, this is a gun to the head. That was his characterization of it. And he said wherever the line is between inducement and coercion, this is beyond the line, unquestionably. And so, in the Supreme Court's opinion, the Medicaid expansion is now optional. If states want to do it, they can, and if they don't want to, they don't have to. Florida and Texas have already announced they're not going to do it, and this will be a key issue in Colorado about deciding whether we're going to do it or not. Now let me just digress into a quick policy argument about why I think it might be a little reckless to do it. Already, there are so many important things that have been a traditional and constitutional and important part of our state budget. In fact, things that are created by our state constitution, such as funding the University of Colorado, or public schools, another very important Colorado constitutional purpose of our state government. And so many other things have been crowded out. And even though the state budget is bigger than ever, it's not that the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights cut tax revenue. Tax revenues continue to rise every single year. We now have a budget, an annual state budget of $20 billion a year. And yet, we keep cutting the University of Colorado, Metro State. So many other things have suffered cuts or decreases, and it is because traditional Medicaid has eaten up more and more and more of our state budget. So when we have this catastrophe right now of Medicaid crowding out so many other important state government needs for the people, do we want to go even further down that road and worsen the problem? Now, the answer to that, some people say, is, well, the federal government says it's going to pay 100% of the non-administrative costs for the first 3 years and 90% thereafter. So the question is then, do you say, well, I buy something, like let's say, am I going to buy a house which has a mortgage that I can't possibly afford and will drive me into bankruptcy quickly? Because some other guy says, oh, don't worry, I'll take care of the mortgage payments. I'll pay all your mortgage payments for the first 3 years, and after that I'll pay most of them. Well, if that generous fellow is Scrooge McDuck, and you can look in his vault and you see he has an enormous amount of money, and you find him trustworthy, maybe you should do something like that. But if the guy who's making this promise about all this free money he's going to give you happens to be $16 trillion in debt already, maybe you don't make a decision that could put you on the hook for billions and billions of dollars based on promises about how much money you're going to get from somebody who can't even pay his own expenses right now and is deep in hock and in fact can't even borrow in the normal financial markets anymore, but is accomplishing most of his borrowing by having the Federal Reserve pretend to buy the debt. So with at the national government level, that's the equivalent of paying your Visa with your MasterCard.